I'm grateful of the opportunity to address some of the areas under the Justice Brief, as it falls within my remit as the Fianna Fáil Justice spokesperson. And at the outset, I regret that the Minister for Justice didn't stay with us to hear our reply, because I'm actually going to pay him a compliment, and I'm going to say he has been described as a reforming minister by some people, and I'm not going to disagree with it. But I will qualify it by saying that he's no more reforming than any of the previous ministers for justice, because our law constantly needs updating and reforming, and he is doing that, and all his predecessors did it also, and there's credit due to all of them. And when I hear this mantra that the present minister is the only minister that is engaged in reform, that's not the case. But he is, and that's to his credit. This week is quite curious in terms of the exercise in statements on government priorities, and I think it's not good enough that we don't have any government-sponsored legislation being processed through the Houses of the Oireachtas this week. The only legislation which has been taken is in private members' time, which happens to be Fianna Fáil's turn on the occasion of this week. We heard plenty of criticism from the government parties when they were on this side of the House about the lack of legislation which had progressed from time to time by the previous government, and this week, when there is no legislation coming through at all, just simply isn't good enough, and it smacks of the hypocrisy in relation to political reform. And speaking about political reform, the government has failed objectively in relation to political reform. And one classic example of the optics of political reform that we have seen from this government are the Friday sittings. Now, the Friday sittings I have described previously as a sham, and I will continue to describe them as a sham. I've attended most of them, and on most occasions the minister who is responsible for the bill which has been sponsored by a private member is never here to respond. It happened the previous first Friday, it happened the first Friday prior to that also, and I was here for both of them. Now, the Minister for Justice on the previous occasion had an informal engagement. It wasn't a formal engagement. But in any event, the proof of the pudding is this, that all of the opposition bills which haven't been voted down by the government, in other words, that have been accepted in principle by the government, haven't been progressed beyond second stage. And that is the proof of the intent that the government has in terms of political reform, is that it's all optics. They'll facilitate you so far, but they won't follow it through. We saw what happened in relation to the Fianna referendum. It was a fundamental attack on the institutions of our democratic institutions, and I think the people of Ireland rightly voted down the government proposal to abolish the Fianna. In other areas of political reform, we have seen, for example, the Taoiseach is available less time now than any of his predecessors to answer questions here in the chamber. Less time. If you look at the time between a Tuesday and a Wednesday, and he's not here on a Thursday, and you add up the amount of time, he's here less than any of his predecessors. In terms of some of the legislation which has been processed under the Justice Brief, the personal insolvency legislation was a huge disappointment. Why? Because it gave the banks a veto in terms of negotiating between their distressed borrowers and themselves. It put the bank at the centre of the decision-making process, and all outside reasonable commentators asked that the bank wouldn't have a veto, that there would be an independent arbitrator and an independent appeals office built in to the process. And I think the statistics which are now beginning to come out of the Insolvency Service of Ireland are quite disappointing, and back up to what we pointed out to when the legislation was processing through this House, that it won't be the success that the government was heralding it to be. And my party put forward proposals through my colleague Deputy Michael McGrath to establish an independent, statutorily based debt settlement office which would have the powers backing it up as an independent office, and the government should have taken that and acted on it. The Land and Conveyancing Act was a huge disappointment. It placed more power into the hands of the banks to evict people and to effect home repossessions. I think the government should, as a priority, look at that and consider repealing some of the draconian powers that they conferred upon the banks to undertake the act of home repossessions. In relation to the judiciary, I heard what the Minister said in relation to his reform proposals, but I think government needs to mend their fences with the judiciary. Yes, we have to have the separation of powers, but unfortunately we had a very unseemly argument between the Minister of the day and the judiciary a number of months ago, which could have been quite serious, but thankfully was diverted. In relation to An Garda Síochána, I want to say this. We had a very lengthy debate in relation to the closure of the 139 Garda stations, and communities felt very let down by the Minister, by the Government, by the Labour Party, by all the backbenchers, depriving communities of their community-based members of An Garda Síochána. We were promised that they would be replaced by Garda clinics, and they weren't. And I've asked the Minister in here on a number of occasions what is the rollout of the replacement Garda clinics, and he was unable to tell me, and that's not good enough. Now, mention was also made in relation to the Garda recruitment campaign, and a lot of people have a lot of interest in it, particularly the Garda reserves, and they feel disappointed and let down that existing members of the Garda Reserve didn't receive some form of prioritisation. But something quite interesting was pointed out to me yesterday in relation to the current recruitment campaign with the online exam, that apparently people who are the applicants are getting other people to sit in for them and do the online exam, and I've written to the Minister in relation to that. Now, I think this government should make it a priority to do the right thing and to do right by people. And what do I mean by that? I mean, our colleague in this House here, Deputy Mick Wallace, was treated disgracefully on national television by the Minister. And the Minister still has to own up to his role and his responsibility in relation to that, using private, privileged, confidential information he got in the briefing to seek to discredit Mick Wallace. I think GSOC were treated appallingly by the Minister. He sought to undermine them, the Taoiseach also, and we discussed it in this House here, and they need to own up to their part in trying to undermine the independent office of GSOC. In relation to Maurice McCabe, that man is owed an apology by the Minister and by the Government for the way he has been treated and how the Minister spoke in this House in relation to Maurice McCabe's alleged non-cooperation with the O'Mahony inquiry. We then, yesterday, Cathaoirleach, had a statement from the former confidential recipient, Mr Oliver Connolly, and the Taoiseach has said that he hopes that he complies or cooperates with the Gearan inquiry. Now, the Justice Committee will be looking for Mr Connolly in due course, but Mr Connolly didn't address in his 4-page statement, didn't address the elephant in the room, being his comments to Maurice McCabe that the Minister would seek to get him and to finish him if he continued in what he was doing. Now, in relation to some of the social agenda, I will be an enthusiastic supporter of the referendum in relation to marriage equality. And I've noted that the Government has stated that this year, 2014, will be a referendum-free year. I think that's a nonsense, quite frankly. We have the local and European elections, and there is no reason why a referendum, for example, on the Family Law Court, the establishment of the Family Law Court, or indeed marriage equality couldn't be taken alongside the local and European elections, when it costs this state anywhere between 16 and 20 million euros to stage a referendum, and this Government has a knack of losing referendums, and they can thank my party and the other parties for assisting them in passing the Court of Appeal referendum. The Minister was quite quick to take a little bit of a credit in relation to that. There was other parties in this House who campaigned to get a successful result in the Court of Appeal, and we will campaign for a successful result in the marriage equality referendum. But I want to finish on this because I have a minute left on the clock. If the Government could make one priority in the remainder of its tenure of this Dáil, it would be to treat people with equity and with fairness in their policies. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that, Cathaoirleach. Independent commentators, the RSI, for example, have concluded and reported on many occasions that this Government and their policies are exceptionally regressive, in that they affect the most vulnerable and the people who can least afford to pay the most. And that is something which the Government needs to prioritise is equity and fairness. Now, I want to finish in relation to medical cards, and I'm holding up this to you, Minister. That lady is a constituent of mine, and she was featured on the front of the Irish Examiner in October 2013. She's a cancer patient, and she had her medical card removed from her. And she went through all the machinery of the state. I raised it in here in the Dáil, and it was only yesterday she got that card on appeal through the HSE Appeals Office in Donegal, where Deputy McLaughlin resides and represents. And I think for a woman who is a cancer patient, suffering from cancer, is going through all the treatment, has had a double mastectomy, to have to go through that, to hold on to a medical card, quite frankly, is disgraceful. And I mean that. I brought it up here with Minister Alex White at the time, and unfortunately she had to go through the ringer to get a medical card, and it wasn't good enough. So equity and fairness out of this government should be a priority, and we haven't seen it. Thank you.